Ernesto Guevara did not become a symbol because he won. He became a symbol because he kept going. Through asthma attacks on a rugby field, through mountain ranges on a broken motorcycle, through jungles that swallowed armies whole, through the ruins of every revolution that failed to live up to what he believed a revolution could be. He gave up a medical career, a nationality, a salary, and eventually his life in pursuit of something most people would have stopped chasing long before the end. This is his story. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born on June 14th, 1928 in Rosario, Argentina. Except that is not entirely true. His actual birth date was May 14th. The certificate was falsified by his parents to conceal a premarital pregnancy. He had not yet drawn a breath, and already his official record was a fiction. It was, in a way, an appropriate beginning for a man who would spend his life insisting that the world as documented and the world as actually lived were two entirely different things. His family was upper middle class in standing and perpetually unstable in practice. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was an architect of Irish-Spanish descent with leftist sympathies and a talent for financial difficulty. His mother, Celia de la Serna, was something else entirely. She was sharp, well-read, and politically progressive at a time, and in a place where that combination in a woman was not particularly encouraged. She took her son to see workers living in poverty. She put books in his hands before he had any real business reading them. She was the first person to show him that the world had a shape, and that the shape was not fair. The family moved constantly. Rosario, then Buenos Aires, then Alta Gracia, a small resort town in the Cordoba Mountains. The reason for the moves was Ernesto's asthma. He had developed it in infancy, and it was severe, the kind that does not arrive politely and leave, but settles in and makes itself at home for life. The mountain air of Alta Gracia was supposed to help. It helped enough. What the asthma could not do was stop him. This is the thing that needs to be understood about Ernesto Guevara before anything else. The illness that should have defined his limitations became instead the first proof of something harder in him. He played rugby. He swam. He cycled. He carried his inhaler in his sock during matches so he would not have to leave the field to use it. He would finish an asthma attack and walk back into the scrum. His friends called him El Fuser, a nickname fused from El Furibundo, the furious one, and his surname for the reckless all-in way he threw himself at everything. The asthma was not an obstacle. It was simply the first thing he refused to accept as one. At home, there were books, over 3,000 of them lining the walls of whatever house the family happened to be occupying. He read with the same intensity he brought to the rugby field. Marx and Engels, Neruda, Borges, Jack London, Jules Verne, Cervantes. All of it before adulthood, all of it absorbed by a boy who was also watching, from a distance, as Spanish Civil War refugees arrived in Argentina. People who had believed in something enough to fight for it, and had lost, and were now living out the consequences of that loss in a country that was not theirs. He was paying attention. He always was. In 1948, he enrolled in medicine at the University of Buenos Aires. He was a capable student and a deeply unconventional one, present enough to advance, distracted enough that everyone around him understood his education was not really happening inside the lecture halls. He fell into a relationship with a girl named Maria del Carmen Ferreira, known as Chichina, whose family was wealthy and thoroughly unimpressed by a young man of uncertain prospects and restless instincts. She was serious about him. He was serious about her. He was also, by then, beginning to plan a trip. He was 23 years old. He had a friend, a motorcycle, and a continent he had not yet seen. The person who came back from that trip would not be the same person who left. He never really was. In December 1951, Ernesto Guevara and his friend Alberto Granado loaded themselves onto a 1939 Norton 500cc motorcycle they had named La Poderosa II, the Mighty One, and rode out of Buenos Aires with a loose plan and very little else. Granado was a biochemist, 29 years old, and wanted to see the continent before he turned 30. Guevara was 23 and wanted something he could not yet name. The plan was to cross South America. The motorcycle had other ideas. La Poderosa broke down repeatedly and was eventually abandoned in Chile. The two men continued anyway, hitchhiking, riding in truck beds, charming their way onto boats, covering ground by whatever means presented itself. What had started as an adventure became, mile by mile, something harder to categorize. The continent they were crossing was not the one Guevara had imagined from the pages of his father's library. It was something else entirely. In northern Chile, they visited the Chuquicamata copper mine. It was owned by American companies. The workers who extracted the ore that made those companies their money lived in conditions that the owners of those companies would not have recognized as human habitation. They were paid almost nothing. They worked until they couldn't. Guevara watched and wrote everything down, and something that had been theoretical, class, exploitation, the distance between who profits and who suffers stopped being theoretical. In Peru, he stood at Machu Picchu and looked out over the evidence of a civilization that had been systematically destroyed, its people subjugated, its wealth extracted, its memory reduced to a tourist destination. Colonialism, rendered in stone. Also in Peru, he worked at the San Pablo leper colony on the edge of the Amazon. The patients there were kept separated from the medical staff by a river. Guevara refused to wear gloves when treating them. On the night of his 24th birthday, he swam across the river in the dark to celebrate with the patients on the other side. It was not a symbolic gesture, it was just what he did, which is perhaps what made it symbolic. He returned to Argentina a different person. He said so himself. I am not me anymore. At least I am not the same me that I was. He finished his medical degree in 1953, qualified as a doctor, and left again almost immediately. He traveled through Bolivia, where he arrived in the aftermath of a revolution, land reforms, nationalized mines, armed peasants in the streets. He was fascinated and unsatisfied. It hadn't gone far enough. He moved on to Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz had been democratically elected and had done something that democratic leaders were not supposed to do. He had taken land from the United Fruit Company, an American corporation, and given it back to the people it had been taken from. To Guevara, arriving in Guatemala City in late 1953, it looked like the beginning of something real. He networked with leftist exiles, deepened his Marxist reading, and met a Peruvian intellectual named Hilda Gadea, who would become his first wife and who introduced him to Cuban exiles, carrying the unfinished business of a failed uprising. Then, in June 1954, the CIA removed Arbenz from power. Operation PB Success installed a right-wing military regime in his place. The experiment ended. Guevara tried to help organize armed resistance. It came to nothing. Arbenz surrendered without a real fight, and that, more than the coup itself, was what broke something open in Guevara's thinking. He sought asylum in the Argentine embassy. He left for Mexico City. He carried one lesson out of Guatemala that he would never put down. Reform was not enough. Elections were not enough. The United States would always protect its interest, and any revolution that was not willing to defend itself with force would not survive long enough to matter. He was 26 years old. He had not yet met Fidel Castro. Mexico City received him as it received most people fleeing somewhere else, without ceremony and without much comfort. He worked odd jobs. He assisted an allergist. He took photographs on the street and sold them. He married Hilda Gadea in 1955, and they had a daughter the following year. He was a doctor without a practice, a revolutionary without a revolution, living in a city full of exiles who had all arrived carrying the same frustration and nowhere particular to put it. Then he met Fidel Castro. The introduction came through Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother, who had been moving through the same networks of Cuban exiles that Guevara had been orbiting for months. The first conversation between Ernesto Guevara and Fidel Castro lasted the entire night. By morning, Guevara had committed. He signed on to the Cuban Revolutionary Movement, the 26th of July movement, named after the failed assault on the Moncada barracks, not as a fighter, but as a doctor. He would not remain a doctor for long. The group trained in secret outside Mexico City under General Alberto Bayo, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War who knew what guerrilla warfare actually required. Guevara was the top student, disciplined, physically relentless, ideologically committed in a way that even the Cubans around him found striking. He was briefly arrested by Mexican police and held for a month before being released. He went straight back to training. On November 25, 1956, 82 men boarded a small yacht called the Grama. It had been designed to carry 12 people. 7 days of rough seas, near starvation, and severe overcrowding later, they landed on the southeastern coast of Cuba 2 days late, off course, and immediately wrong-footed. Batista's forces were waiting. At Alegria de Pio, the group was ambushed and scattered. Of 82 men, perhaps 20 survived and made it into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Guevara was shot in the neck. At the moment the ambush began, he had to choose between a box of medical supplies and a box of ammunition. He took the ammunition. The survivors hid in the mountains and began again. They recruited campesinos, peasants who had been living under Batista's violence long enough to be ready for something different. Guevara proved to be an extraordinary guerrilla commander. He was tactically brilliant, physically austere, eating the same food as his men, carrying his own pack, treating his asthma with whatever improvised means the mountains offered. He also executed informers and deserters. He built schools and medical clinics and guerrilla camps. He was, simultaneously, both of those things, and he saw no contradiction between them. The force grew. Batista's army, better equipped and far larger, could not root them out. By late 1958, the revolution had reached its final movement. Fidel sent Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos westward to take the island. In December 1958, Guevara led the Battle of Santa Clara. With a small, exhausted force, he attacked a city and won it, including the derailing of an armored train Batista had sent with reinforcements, brought down by a bulldozer lifting the tracks. The train became a symbol. The city's fall broke Batista's will entirely. On the last night of 1958, Batista boarded a plane and left. Havana celebrated. Guevara was 31 years old, and the revolution he had joined as a doctor in a Mexico City kitchen had succeeded. What came next was harder. The tribunals at La Cabaña Fortress, the executions, the attempt to remake an economy through ideology rather than incentive. The failures he was honest enough to admit publicly. Cuba was won. Governing it was a different kind of war, and Guevara was not built for the kind of compromises it demanded. He was already thinking about somewhere else. In 1965, Ernesto Guevara disappeared. He resigned everything: his position as Minister of Industries, his rank as commander, his Cuban citizenship, the life he had built inside the revolution he had helped win. He wrote a farewell letter to Fidel Castro that was not made public for months, in which he renounced every title and every privilege and stated simply that other nations of the world were calling for him. Then he walked out of public life entirely, and for a long time the world did not know where he had gone. He had gone to the Congo. The Simba Rebellion in the Democratic Republic of Congo was, in theory, exactly what his ideology required. A leftist insurgency in a country still bleeding from the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and the long violence of colonial extraction. In practice, it was a catastrophe. The Congolese fighters Guevara was sent to support believed that ritual magic made them bulletproof. They refused direct orders. They abandoned positions. They showed, by his own account, almost no willingness to fight. He stayed for 7 months, suffering through dysentery, asthma, and a despair he recorded with unflinching honesty. He left having accomplished nothing. He spent several months recovering in Tanzania and Prague, ill and largely alone, and then he made his final decision: Bolivia. The logic was sound, on paper. Bolivia sat at the center of the continent, bordered by Argentina, Peru, Chile, and Brazil. A single successful guerrilla foco there could spread revolution in 4 directions simultaneously. The country had a history of political instability and a large indigenous peasant population, with every material reason to revolt. Guevara arrived in November 1966 in disguise. Glasses, a bald cap, a fake Uruguayan passport under the name Adolfo Mena Gonzalez. Photographs from this period show a man so thoroughly transformed that people who knew him well did not recognize the face. Almost immediately, everything went wrong. The Bolivian Communist Party, which had promised cooperation, withdrew it before the campaign had properly begun. The peasants in the surrounding region did not rally to the guerrillas. They were frightened, suspicious, and, as had happened in the Congo, reported the strangers in the jungle to the authorities. Communications with Havana broke down and stayed broken for months. The CIA was involved, coordinating with Bolivian forces through a Cuban-American operative named Felix Rodriguez. United States Special Forces trained Bolivian Rangers with one specific purpose: to find Guevara and end the insurgency. His body was failing him. The asthma that he had refused to accept as a limitation, his entire life had become one at last, severe and unmanageable without proper medicine, sometimes leaving him incapacitated in the field. The group was starving. The force that had once been building shrank instead. Deaths, desertions, captures. Through all of it, he kept writing. The Bolivian diary records everything with the same unflinching precision he had brought to everything else. The failures, the hunger, the deaths of men he had led there, his own deterioration. It is not the diary of a man constructing a legend. It is the diary of a man watching something collapse and refusing to look away. His last entry was October 7th, 1967. The following morning, Bolivian Rangers surrounded the ravine at Quebrada del Euro, where Guevara and the remaining 17 men of his force were hiding. A firefight broke out. He was shot in the leg. His rifle was destroyed by a bullet. He was taken alive. They held him in a one-room schoolhouse in the village of La Higuera. The Bolivian president ordered his execution. There would be no trial. A soldier named Mario Terán was chosen to carry it out. Terán stood at the door of the schoolhouse and hesitated. Guevara looked at him. "Shoot, coward," he said. "You are only going to kill a man." He was 39 years old. His body was displayed to the international press, strapped to a stretcher, shirtless, eyes open, an image that traveled around the world within days and has never really stopped traveling. His hands were removed to preserve fingerprints as proof of identity. He was buried in secret near Vallegrande Airport, and the location was not confirmed for 30 years. He had wanted to ignite a continent. He had not. But the photograph taken of him in a Havana ballroom 7 years earlier, Alberto Corda's image, the beret, the set of the jaw, the eyes focused on something in the distance, became, in the months and years that followed, arguably the most reproduced photograph in human history. He did not liberate Latin America. He was wrong about a great many things. But the face endures, and so does the question it keeps asking, which is not whether he was right, but whether that kind of commitment, that willingness to give absolutely everything, is something the world has ever quite known what to do with. It hasn't. Ernesto Guevara was 39 years old when he died in a schoolhouse in a village most of the world had never heard of, having failed in his last 2 campaigns, far from every country he had ever tried to liberate. He never saw the continent united. He never saw the new man he believed history could produce. What he left behind was a diary, a photograph, and a question that his executioners did not answer when they pulled the trigger, because you cannot shoot an idea even when the man carrying it is gone. Subscribe so I can keep making more of these videos. Thanks.